Welcome back to my everyday cosplay series where I take inspiration from costumes in my favorite movies and shows and turn them into accessories you could wear all the time without anybody knowing how big of a nerd you are. Today I'm taking inspiration from House of the Dragon. I'm really excited for season 2. I'm definitely Team Black, but I will happily watch Aemond and Vhagar commit crimes until the end of time. They're my favorite duo. I already made Aemond's eye patch from season 1, and you can find that video on my channel. In the first season, young Rhaenyra wears this black dragon scale jacket every time she's dragon riding, and the second it popped up on screen, I fell in love with it. I was like, I need this. I'm not a huge sewer, so instead I designed some leather cuffs inspired by the dragon scale textures that are on the sleeves. Since I'm an unstoppable agent of chaos, not only did I design a wide bracer style dragon scale cuff, but I also designed a small, narrower version, and because I have no idea when to quit, I also designed a choker and some pendants. As always, you can find all of my patterns in my Etsy shop as PDF instant downloads. While this pattern was designed for leather, if you're more of a foam person, there's no reason that you couldn't use EVA foam to make this project and glue instead of rivet. Just saying. You always want to make sure you select actual size in your print settings. For this project, I do recommend printing on cardstock if you have it. If you don't, that's no big deal, but I do recommend then tracing your scale patterns onto some thicker cardboard. Something like a cereal box would work great. Thicker cardboard will make your scales a lot easier to cut out, and it will make your pattern last longer as well. The pattern tells you how many of each scale to cut out. I also included some extra scales just so you can use them when your first scale gets damaged. First up, I'm just going to punch holes in my scale pattern. For this project, you could use any leather that you like as long as the thickness works with your rivets. Years ago, somebody gave me a giant Rubbermaid bin full of leather scraps. I honestly think this used to be a couch or some other kind of upholstery. You can still see some seams in it. Leather scales are a fantastic way to use up tiny little leather scraps, and they're one of the reasons why I never toss any of my scraps unless they're really, really small. I've made scales a few times before. This scale mail was a tester for some armor that I have yet to complete. I also utilized tiny little scales in my baby orc project. Like I said, you could use really any leather for this project. I wouldn't recommend going any thicker than, say, 5 ounce for the scales, or you will hate your life when you're cutting them out. I used about a 2 ounce for my scales, and then for my cuff itself, I used maybe about a 6 ounce. The most important thing is that the rivets that you're going to use are the correct length for the combination of your scale leather and your cuff leather. I do recommend that you test this on a bit of scrap at the very beginning to save yourself a lot of headaches. So I'm just tracing my scales onto the leather using a regular pen. I don't usually like a pen for tracing, but this is black leather, so it was kind of necessary. As you can see, I'm also marking the hole at the same time. I do recommend that you punch your holes now before you cut out all your scales. It's just going to be a lot easier and way more efficient. Now I'm cutting my scales out using sharp fabric scissors. This is where you're going to find out that selecting a nice piece of leather with a smooth back is going to make this a lot nicer looking in the end. Here's where you want to load up a good audiobook or a podcast because this will be a little bit tedious and take you a while. The reason that I didn't design this pattern in strips of scales is because it is wrapped around such a tight curve. When you're wrapping around a curve, the thickness of the leather is going to change the way that the holes line up. And I wanted to make the pattern so it would work for anybody, no matter what thickness they used. So this is why I went with individual scales instead of strips. Here are all of the scales for my bracer style cuff. Now I'm prepping the scales for my narrower cuff. For this one, I decided to go for a little bit of a different look, and I used veg tan cowhide for this. Again, I used about a 2 ounce leather for the scales. This time I traced around all the scales with a pencil, so it's a little hard to see them on camera. Then I punched out all of my holes and cut the scales out using a sharp X-Acto knife. Then I dampened all of my scales and I added a little bit of texture with some backgrounding tools. Honestly, this leather is really too thin for tooling, and it was also too wet for tooling, but it was getting kind of late at night, and I really wanted to get some texture onto these before it was too late to hammer and annoy my neighbors. I also wanted to let it dry overnight, so I just went ahead and added some texture to the wet leather. Obviously, everything about that is very suboptimal, but I was flying by the seat of my pants at this point. Then I did a little bit of wet forming since the scales were damp and left them to dry overnight. By the time I was done wet forming, the texture was practically gone, so do as I say and not as I do. Let your leather dry down more beforehand. Anyway, this is what they looked like when I was done. Next, I cut out my cuff leather. I used about a 6 ounce for each of these. Here I am trying to find the best layout on my hide to waste the least amount of leather possible. I trace the shape onto the leather and then cut it out with my X-Acto knife. I'm using a number 2 beveler here just to round the edges of the leather. The main thing with using a beveler is you want to keep it at a consistent angle, run it along the edge of your leather, and it just shaves off the corner to create a rounded edge. Next up, I dyed the base of my choker and also my bracer style cuff. I decided to use just plain black for this. I dyed the edges and then dye the front with a wool dauber. I find of all of the leather dye colors, black is the easiest to get on evenly. You really can't go wrong with it. Just running my wool dauber back and forth across the front of the leather until I have a nice even dye across the whole surface. Then I went ahead and dyed my narrower cuff red. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was actually a major derp because this cuff was one that I had cut out in preparation for a future project. Then I actually put on a glove for once and dip dyed all of my scales using red and purple dyes. Dip dyeing really eats up your dye, so I don't recommend it for big projects, but for little tiny pieces like this, it's the fastest and most efficient way to go about it. I'm just adding a little bit of extra with a paintbrush. I left everything to dry for a few hours, and then I added my leather finish. Before adding finish to the black dye, I buffed the surface. I don't know why black specifically leaves so much on the surface, but I do find buffing it off will give you a better result and less rub off. Here I'm applying my finish of choice, which is watered down acrylic resin. I like to apply it with a paintbrush because I find it goes on smoother, and then I rub over and over it until all of the bubbles are gone. I kind of dip dyed my scales as well and rubbed the excess off with a paintbrush. It was at this point I realized my major derp of dyeing the wrong cuffs, so I trimmed this one down to size and re-dyed the edges. Once my finish had dried for a while, I moved out to my camper van to do my hole punching and riveting, one, so I didn't annoy the hell out of my neighbors, and two, because it was a really nice day and I didn't want to be inside. So if you're seeing flies go through the frame and random lighting changes, that's why. Now, it may seem time wasting to punch holes in your pattern when you can just mark through it, but I find it is the fastest and most accurate way to transfer holes when the layout is important. Now is a good time to mention that the size of the holes on my pattern are not necessarily going to be accurate for you. I do recommend that you take a small scrap of your cuff leather and a small scrap of your scale leather and test your rivet size as well as your hole size before you continue. You will save yourself a lot of headache in the long run. I'm going to lay my pattern on top of my leather, placing it inside of the holes and pressing down nice and hard. I'm just working my way down the choker, punching all of the holes. It's mentioned on the choker pattern, but you can just trim it down to size that fits for your neck. Here's a little peek at my rivet container. There's so many different lengths and sizes. This is why I say you need to test it first. I got this container at the craft store Michael's. I think it's for sorting beads. It's fantastic for sorting leather hardware. Just don't knock it onto the floor. Ask me how I know. For the choker, I hadn't actually punched the holes in the scales yet, so I'm just doing that now. The pattern indicates the scale layout. You begin at one end and work your way along, overlapping the scales as you go. Now you can see that I'm using silver rivets. It does look kind of cool, but I have mad regrets about not using black rivets for my black scales. Just a warning so you can think about what you want to do. Now I'm just continuing all the way along the choker, overlapping my scales as I go. When you begin with the rivets, it's kind of slow and fiddly, but you will settle into a rhythm with it and it'll start to go faster. Just remember to leave the hole at either end open so that you can add your ties. Now that my choker is all riveted, I'm doing the same steps with my narrow cuff. First of all, punching all of the holes in the pattern. You'll see I'm using a small poundo board behind my holes. This is just to protect your hole punches when you're doing your punching. As always, I've linked some tools and supplies down in the description. Affiliate links help support your girl. And here I'm adding all of the holes to my bracer style cuff. You'll see that the holes for the ties along the edges were larger holes. This is totally optional. I made my holes of a size that I could fit eyelets into them if I wanted to. Eyelets are definitely optional, and in the end, I didn't even end up adding them. Your choice. Now I've laid my pattern on top of my cuff, and I'm marking all of the holes using my hole punch. Just fitting the punch within the hole and pressing down hard. And marking all of the holes for my narrow cuff in the same manner. Now I'm punching out all of my holes. The reason that I like marking my holes with the punch itself is that it creates an indent in the leather. And when you go to punch your holes, you'll find that your punch kind of settles into that little indent. So you don't have to line up your punch visually, you can actually feel where it goes, and this makes it way faster overall. I'm doing the same with my bracer style cuff and punching out all the holes. And here's what it looks like all punched out. Now it's time to add all of the scales. The pattern indicates which order you want to apply your scales. I found it easiest to work row by row. First, I inserted all of my rivet backs along the first row. I found that the best layout was to start with the center scale and work my way towards the edges. Once I figured out the layout of the scales, I added my rivet tops and riveted on the first row. This is a rivet setter that I'm using to hammer the top of the rivet, giving it a couple taps with a mallet. If you aren't very practiced with rivets, you sure will be by the end of this project. You definitely want to be hammering against an anvil, a slate, or some other kind of solid surface. Once you've riveted your first row, you're going to repeat that pattern for the next row. First, I'm adding all of my rivets. Then I'm placing all of my scales, starting with the center and working out towards the edges. And then I'm adding my rivet tops and setting them with the rivet setter. You're going to continue repeating this same pattern row by row all the way up the cuff. I skipped recording a few rows because I needed to charge my camera. Once you hit this point and you have only that one complete row left, you're going to switch. You're going to add just one scale at the center. You're going to add 2 scales to the next row. And you're going to add 3 scales to the row after that. Now you're going to switch to the larger scale type. I recommend you start with the 2 corner ones. I didn't, and I had to do some fiddling afterwards. Then add your next row and work your way towards the top. I have a diagram in my pattern to help with this step, so it's a little less confusing. All of my wetting, punching, and shaping had caused the holes in my red scales to shrink a little bit, so I just punched them out a second time. This cuff is a little bit more straightforward. You just want to add your scales row by row, making sure that you're starting with them pointing in the direction that you want them to go. I started with the wider end of the cuff, pointing them up the arm. Working my way along row by row, adding all of the backs at once, then adding the scale and adding the cap to set it in place. And here's what it looks like all riveted. This is so cool. I'm really glad that I molded the tips of the scales out because it makes a really interesting shape. For my last trick, I'm just doing the pendants. These were inspired by the pattern on the collar of her jacket. There's a few ways you can make these. You can do what I'm doing here and layer together several pieces of leather. I just cut the holes out and then put a metallic looking leather behind. I always recommend barge cement for leather, but apparently I didn't have any, so I just used E6000 and then glued it all together. This is sort of what it looks like on her jacket. It looks like there's an inlay of a silvery leather behind the black leather, but the only leather that I had was sort of a bluey purple, and this is kind of unhinged. It's not my favorite. I just wanted to provide you with a few options of ways that you could utilize this pattern. Another option for the pendant is to use a thick veg tan. You could either cut the holes out entirely like this, or you could use tooling to create the depth in the inlay. Then I dyed the outside black and the inside silver just to make it look as much like the jacket as possible. You could wear the pendants on their own, either individually or together in a lariat style. You could also combine them with the choker by adding them to the choker ties. So many options. And here are the cuffs all done. I thought I was gonna like the red one better, but I absolutely love the texture of this black one. I want to make more. I want to make both sides. I want to make a whole jacket. I want to make an entire armor with this black scale texture. It's so cool. I do regret not using black rivets. I think that would have looked cleaner, but the silver rivets still look really cool. You can decide for yourself what you want to do. Follow along for more fantasy nerdery and let me know down below what you want me to make next because I'm totally open to ideas. I'm having so much fun with this everyday cosplay series. I already have my next 2 projects planned out, but for now I'm putting on my dragon scales and flying away on my dragon.